So, I've been thinking a lot about some of the suggestions from the comments on my last post. Many of you suggested I look deeper into the boy's history, to find out more about where he came from, his time at the orphanage, and anything that might explain what's happening. Believe me when I say, I tried. I called the orphanage again and spoke to the same social worker, but there was no new information. Every file they had on him was clean. There were no red flags, no unusual behavior, and no previous incidents. It's like he was just another kid, at least on paper. But that's just it. The more time I spend with him, the less I believe that. There's something wrong here, something they're not telling me, or something even they don't know. So I took another suggestion from you all and considered having someone else look at him. Maybe a child psychologist or someone who could understand him better than I do. It seemed like a good idea, right? That's when things got even weirder. And I didn't think that was possible. I had a friend of mine, Richard, come over last weekend. We've known each other for years, and he works with kids in a social capacity, so I figured he might be able to give me some perspective. He's not a psychologist or anything, but he's good at reading people. Well, better than me, at least. I thought maybe having another person around could help ease the tension, especially since Richard is used to handling all kinds of situations. When he got here, things seemed normal at first. The boy was quiet, as usual, sitting in the living room while Richard and I caught up. I didn't mention the nightmares right away. I figured I'd ease into it and let him spend some time with the kid first. Maybe he'd pick up on something I hadn't. We were about an hour into the visit when things started getting very strange. Richard and I were sitting in the kitchen, chatting while the boy played with a toy truck on the floor. I'd been trying to keep the conversation light, not wanting to bring up anything too heavy just yet. But then Richard suddenly went quiet, like dead silent. He stopped mid-sentence, his eyes fixed on something behind me. I turned around, half expecting to see the boy standing there, but he was still in the living room, completely absorbed in whatever game he was playing. But the way Richard was looking, it was like he'd seen something that wasn't there. Trying to keep my voice casual, I asked Richard what he was looking at, but my heart was already racing. He didn't answer right away. His eyes were wide, like he was trying to process something, but couldn't quite wrap his head around it. Finally, he shook his head and looked at me, his face pale. He asked me in a low voice if I heard anything. Confused, I questioned what he meant by that. He said he thought he had heard someone whispering something, but then decided it was just his imagination and told me to forget it. However, that word, whispering, it sent a jolt through me. My mind immediately flashed back to those nights when I'd heard it too, when I'd gone to the boy's room to find him huddled in the corner. But Richard hadn't been here for any of that. He didn't know about the whispers. I laughed it off, but I couldn't ignore the knot tightening in my stomach. I then awkwardly agreed that he must have imagined it. Even using a silly reason like the quietness of this place can play tricks on you. Richard nodded, but I could tell he wasn't convinced. He kept glancing toward the hallway, where the boy's room was, like he was waiting for something else to happen. The conversation died after that. We tried to keep talking, but the energy was all wrong. Richard was distracted, and I couldn't stop thinking about what he'd said. Eventually, he suggested we go into the living room to spend some time with the boy. I agreed, thinking it might break the tension. We sat down on the couch, watching the boy as he pushed the truck across the floor. It seemed like a normal enough moment, but there was this odd heaviness in the air. I don't know how to explain it, but it felt like we weren't alone in the room. Like there was something or someone else there watching us. That's when Richard leaned over and whispered to me that he felt something was off with the boy. I glanced at the boy, my heart pounding. Then I asked him to explain what he meant. Richard hesitated, his eyes flicking to the boy and then back to me. Then he proceeded to skeptically say that it felt like the boy wasn't actually here. That's when the boy stopped playing. He didn't turn to look at us or say anything, but he just froze, the truck motionless in his hands. The room went completely silent, like the air had been sucked out of it. Richard and I exchanged a look, and I could see the unease written all over his face. There was something about the way the boy was sitting so still, so unnaturally still, that made my skin crawl. Richard cleared his throat, trying to sound casual as he checked up on the boy. The boy didn't respond. He didn't even move. It was like he hadn't heard him at all. I was just about to get up and check on him as well when the doorbell rang. It startled both of us. I hadn't been expecting anyone, and honestly, the sudden noise felt jarring after the eerie silence that had settled over the house. I went to the door, half expecting it to be a delivery or a neighbor, but when I opened it, no one was there. At least that's what I thought at first. I stepped outside, glancing around, but the street was empty. No cars, no people, just the wind rustling the trees. I was about to head back inside when I noticed something on the doorstep. A small, folded piece of paper. It hadn't been there before. I picked it up, unfolding it with shaky hands. The message inside was short, just a few words scrawled in messy handwriting. "You're not safe." That was it. No signature, no explanation. Just those 3 words, hanging in the air like a threat. I stood there for what felt like forever, trying to make sense of it. Was it a prank? Some kind of joke? But something about the note didn't feel like a joke. It just felt wrong, like it was meant for me. Like someone knew exactly what was going on in this house. When I went back inside, Richard could tell something was off. I showed him the note, and his reaction was exactly what I expected. Confusion mixed with fear. He suggested that we talk to a professional. Things were getting out of hand. I didn't argue. I knew he was right. Things were spiraling, and I had no idea how to stop it. But what happened next made me realize that whatever this was, it wasn't something I could just fix by calling a psychologist. Later that night, after Richard left, I put the boy to bed. He didn't say much, but that wasn't unusual. I checked the windows, locked the doors, and double-checked the locks. I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching us, and that note. It was burned into my mind. The words, "You're not safe," were all I could focus on. I went to bed, but I couldn't sleep. Every little sound made me jump. The creak of the floorboards, the rustle of the wind outside. I felt like I was waiting for something to happen, like the air itself was holding its breath. And then, around 2 a.m., I heard it. The front door. It wasn't loud, just the faintest sound of the handle turning. But I knew I had locked it. I knew it had been locked. I shot out of bed, heart pounding, and ran to the front door. It was still shut, still locked, but the air around it was cold. Freezing, actually. My breath fogged up in front of me as I stood there, staring at the door, trying to figure out what was happening. That's when I heard the footsteps. They were faint, coming from the hallway behind me. Slow, deliberate, like someone or something was walking toward me. But when I turned around, the hallway was empty. I stood there, frozen, listening to the sound of those footsteps growing louder and closer. But there was no one there. No one in the hallway and no one in the house. At least, no one I could see. I bolted back to the boy's room, half expecting to find him standing in the corner like he had been those other nights. But when I opened the door, he was sound asleep, curled up under the blankets, breathing softly. The footsteps stopped. I stood in the doorway, my heart racing, trying to make sense of what was happening. But there was no sense to be made. The house was quiet again, as if nothing had happened at all. But I knew better. Something had been in the house with me. Something had been watching. The next morning, I called Richard and I told him everything. I told him about the note, the footsteps, the cold air. I thought he'd tell me I was losing it, that I was letting my imagination run wild. But instead, he just listened. When I finished, he was quiet for a long time. Then, after what seemed like an eternity, he spoke. He said that he believed me. From the moment he laid eyes on the boy, something felt wrong to him. I didn't need him to tell me that. I knew something was wrong. But what could I do about it? Every time I thought I had a plan, the situation would shift, twist in ways I couldn't predict. I couldn't even tell if the boy was involved or just another victim of whatever was happening. I've been looking over that note again and again, trying to figure out who could have left it, what it means. You're not safe. I don't know if they were talking about me or him. Maybe both. Maybe neither. Whatever this is, it's not stopping. It's getting worse. And I'm not sure how much longer I can keep pretending everything is okay. For now, I'll leave it here. I'm trying to figure out my next move, but I'll post again when I have more answers or if something stranger happens. If any of you have experienced something like this or have any other ideas, I'm all ears. For more chilling stories, like and subscribe.